It was a peaceful spring evening in the southern suburbs of Nashville. A gentle breeze stirred the rows of trees, casting shadows on the asphalt road still warm from the late afternoon sun. This residential area was usually quiet and calm, so much so that you could hear the faint chirping of insects or the distant laughter of children playing at the end of the street. But that night, the sound that shattered the silence was not a fire engine siren, nor loud music from a neighbor's house. It was a scream, a painful, sudden, and desperate scream. It echoed from a roadside lawn where a silver car had stopped less than 5 minutes earlier. The car door was thrown open. An elderly man lay flat on the ground, his elbows bent backward awkwardly, his head pressed against the grass, breathing rapid and panicked. He tried to speak, but his throat was dry and his voice choked. A police officer in a dark uniform was pressing his knee hard into the man's back, restraining him as if he were a violent criminal, fiercely resisting arrest. But no, that man with salt and pepper hair and trembling hands was just a citizen never having broken the law on his way home after reading at the library. That moment lasted only a few minutes, but the feeling stretched like an hour. Every ragged breath he took, every tightening of the handcuffs, every flicker of the headlights on his bloody, dusty, wrinkled face. Neighbors initially thinking it was a criminal chase began to step out onto their porches. Some held phones trembling as they recorded. Others stood silently clutching their loved ones in disbelief at what was unfolding before their eyes. That man's name was Frederick Jameson, a retired lawyer 66 years old. He had been a legal advisor for civil rights organizations in Tennessee for over 3 decades. He had stood in court defending the vulnerable fighting to change unfair laws, a man of reasoned words and professional ethics. And that night he became a victim of the very system he had trusted to protect him. While Frederick was pinned to the ground, the police officer said nothing but harsh commands. "Don't move, resist, and I'll charge you," his voice sharp and impatient. But Frederick did not resist. He only asked through tears, "What did I do wrong? Please tell me why." No one answered. When he was pulled up, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, his shirt torn, blood oozing from a wound at his temple. His eyes seemed to show not only physical pain, but an internal collapse, a profound shock. Not because he didn't know such things had happened before, but because he never thought it would happen to him. Not here, not to someone like him. Only a few witnessed the whole event. A student across the street, still holding a water bottle frozen in place. A woman walking her dog who would later say that Frederick's scream was a sound that made my heart ache as if it were my own father being beaten. As the police car left the neighborhood carrying Frederick's frail body in the back seat, the whole street fell into a heavy silence. A silence different from the peacefulness before. This silence was the result of fear, doubt, and a quiet question stirring in everyone's heart. If he isn't safe, then who is? The story didn't begin in the courtroom. It began on that lawn. In the dark, under the pale street lights, in insect sounds drowned out by the anguished breathing. A seemingly minor incident, a routine administrative stop, but it sparked one of the most extensive internal investigations the Department of Justice had conducted into a police department in 20 years. All started with a scream, and the story had only just begun. Before we jump into today's story, feel free to drop a comment, letting us know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. It helps us see how far the story has traveled and who it's connecting with. Now let's get started. His name was Frederick Jameson, 66 years old, thin, tall hair, silver with a few black strands. A deep voice speaking slowly as if every word was carefully weighed. A man who didn't need to shout to command respect. Frederick had been one of Nashville's top lawyers for nearly 4 decades. He didn't represent big corporations or serve as legal counsel for the wealthy. He chose a different path. He stood with the vulnerable. He had defended young black men arrested without cause. He had written petitions opposing police immunity in cases of racially motivated violence. He had stood before the state Supreme Court arguing, "The Constitution is not a blank sheet of paper, it is a blood pact for justice." That man now was lying on the lawn, not as a protector of the law, but as a victim, handcuffed, beaten, humiliated. What made it even more terrifying was not the officer's actions, but the fact that it happened to Frederick Jameson himself, the man who had stood alongside the Department of Justice in human rights lawsuits, the man who had written books on civil rights, the man who had taught constitutional law at Vanderbilt University, a man who knew the law better than any officer in uniform ever could. That afternoon, Frederick did nothing wrong. He was driving home from the public library. On the passenger seat lay the book he had just borrowed, an old edition of W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk. He planned to go home, pour a cup of tea, and read a few chapters before dinner. But he never made it home. A faint siren sounded behind him, flashing red and blue lights. He signaled slowly and pulled over to the side. His hands rested on the steering wheel as he had taught his students. Always keep your hands visible. Don't touch your phone, don't look down, don't reach for your wallet unless asked. The window rolled down. A police officer approached, much younger than him, about 30 years old, flushed face. His name was Grant Keller, license and registration. Frederick nodded slightly. "Hello, officer. May I take my wallet out of my jacket pocket?" No reply, just a hostile look. He took out his wallet, handed over the documents, waited. "This your car?" "Yes, it's mine. The plates are valid. Do you know why I stopped you?" Frederick looked at him slowly. "I'm not sure, officer. I was driving the speed limit and signaled before turning. If I made a mistake, I'm willing to hear the explanation." That answer irritated Grant. He didn't like being met with politeness. Maybe he was looking for an excuse. Maybe he felt challenged. After a few exchanges, the order came, "Step out of the car." Now, Frederick could have refused. He could have asked why. But he stepped out, partly because he had taught that sometimes staying calm is the strongest weapon. But as soon as he stepped out, everything shifted. His arm was twisted behind his back. A sudden shove made him slip, his head hitting the ground. Before he could ask, "Why am I being arrested?" the cuffs were tightened around his wrists. No warning, no resistance, no reason. It wasn't until a later hearing that it came to light. Grant Keller never ran the license plate. There was no administrative reason to stop the car, no traffic violation, and the man lying there beaten, dragged like a criminal, was a retired lawyer, awarded the Tennessee Civil Rights Medal in 2011, a man who had won justice for countless nameless people, and now he needed justice for himself. After the incident, many of Frederick's old friends spoke out. Professor Thomas Lee, who had taught alongside him at the university, choked up at a panel discussion. "I used to think that if anyone among us would be protected by the system, it would be Fred." Yet, he was not only beaten, but silenced. Silence, a different kind of violence, a form of denying humanity that people like Frederick had fought against all their lives. Later, Frederick himself said in a brief interview, "I know the law, but no one needs to know the law to be treated like a human being." Those words resonated, not just as pain, but as a warning. The man lying on the lawn that night, Anon, was not just Frederick Jameson. He was a reflection of thousands stripped of dignity by those who wore badges in the name of protecting justice. And from that spot, from the bloodstained grass and shame, a bigger story began to take shape. Grant Keller is now 34 years old, tall, fit hair, closely shaved on the sides with a confident stride. He joined the Nashville Southside Police Department over 10 years ago. Early in his career, Grant was described as quick, proactive, full of enthusiasm. But after a few years, colleagues stopped calling him enthusiastic and started saying he was hot-headed and hard to control. Sergeant Keller was not a criminal. He wasn't a street thug. He was an officer with a name-tag uniform authority to stop cars, question people, and if necessary, use force. But what made things dangerous was the system that made him believe that power came without accountability. Internal records show that Grant Keller was complained against 6 times in just 3 years. A black woman wrongly arrested for jaywalking said he used racial slurs against her. A Latino father had his collarbone broken after refusing to show his phone. A student was pinned down on a car hood for uncooperative attitude when he was only asking why he was being stopped. All 6 cases were handled internally. The outcomes: insufficient evidence. No procedure violation. Officer acted within permissible limits. No one was disciplined. Not a single note was added to the official record. And so Grant Keller continued patrolling the streets, continuing to feel untouchable. Residents in the area knew him well. Some avoided him, unwilling to cause trouble. Some quietly turned away, swallowing their frustration in silence. But some secretly thought maybe he's unpleasant, but at least he keeps order. It wasn't until he beat a retired lawyer, a white man with status and a voice, that everything shattered. The day after Frederick Jameson's arrest, Grant was not suspended. He still went to the station, greeted colleagues, drank coffee like any other day. In the break room, he even joked that old man should have known better. Lucky I held back. A young officer new to the unit for a few months looked at him puzzled. But he didn't resist, right? Why did you have to use force? Grant smirked. You've never seen the way people like him look at us. They think they're better. They think they know the law better than we do. Then he clapped the young officer on the shoulder, smiling coldly. I just taught him a lesson. Keller didn't think he was wrong, because no one inside ever told him he was. The system didn't just tolerate it, it supported it. A senior officer who directly signed off on internal reports once said in a closed meeting, "Our police force is being smeared by the media. If we don't protect our own, we'll lose all credibility." Credibility, that word was used like a shield to hide all wrongdoing. But this time, things were different. The video of Grant pressing Frederick's head to the ground spread at lightning speed. A bystander had accidentally recorded the entire event on a dash cam. The scene was chillingly clear, Frederick calmly asking why he was stopped. Then the shove, the body hitting the ground, his groans and cries for help. The truth could no longer be denied. The media got involved. Social media exploded. While the police department initially tried to issue a brief statement, Officer Keller acted according to patrol procedure. Tens of thousands shared the video, tagging the Department of Justice, human rights organizations, and prominent politicians. People who had never heard of Grant Keller now knew his face as a symbol of power, abused, nurtured by silence and cover-ups. After a few days under public pressure, the police department was forced to suspend Keller, citing awaiting further investigation results. At an internal meeting, when asked if he wanted to say anything, Grant replied coldly, "I was just doing what I was trained to do. If there's a fault, it's the fault of the whole system." Those words, whether intentionally or not, were the most terrifying confession. It's not just Grant Keller who was the problem. It's the system that created him, that keeps him, and protects him. Frederick Jameson may be the first to dare bring this story to light. But dozens, hundreds of others have endured being beaten, humiliated, labeled, without cameras, without lawyers, without justice. His name is Grant Keller, a police sergeant, a man with a badge and a fist, a clear product of a system that has forgotten protecting the law never means standing above the law. That afternoon, the Nashville sky was clear without a single cloud. The sun was gentle, and the breeze was just enough to make the leaves sway softly along the shaded streets. Frederick Jameson had been at the public library for nearly 2 hours, a place he visited every Tuesday and Friday without fail. It was almost a sacred routine, a quiet space where he could sit by the window, reading old books, jotting notes with a fountain pen, or simply observing life moving slowly outside the glass pane. That day, he borrowed a book he had loved since his college days, The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin. He had read it dozens of times, but every time it felt fresh. Frederick carefully wrapped the book in a leather bag, fastened the strap neatly, and leisurely headed to his car. He drove a silver sedan over 10 years old, a car neither flashy nor eye-catching, but full of memories. The drive home was only about 10 minutes, but he would never make it home that day. At a small intersection with Madison Avenue, the light turned from red to green. Frederick had just turned left when in the rearview mirror he saw flashing blue and red lights behind him. A police car. No siren, no loudspeaker, just lights. He blinked, then calmly signaled and slowly pulled over to the side. He rolled down the window, kept his hands on the steering wheel. Looked straight ahead. This was something he always taught young law students. When stopped by police, don't move too much. Stay calm. Show them you're not a threat. Officer Grant Keller approached, hand resting on his holster. He didn't greet, didn't ask. He just looked Frederick up and down, then tilted his head toward the window. License and registration. Frederick replied softly, yes, officer. May I get my wallet from my pocket? Keller said nothing, just stared, his gaze seeming to already hold a verdict. Frederick took out his wallet and the vehicle registration from the case. Everything was in order. This your car? Yes. Registered in my name. Keller nodded, then looked at him again, this time longer. Where do you live? Evergreen Street, near the city park. What are you doing in this area? I was at the library. At this time, the library closes at 6. I left at 5:40. A silence, no sirens, no radio chatter, only the steady hum of the engine. Suddenly, Keller stepped back half a pace, hand firmly on his belt. Get out of the car. Frederick blinked. Excuse me, is there a problem, officer? You're suspected of suspicious activity. Frederick frowned but stayed calm. I'm just driving home from the library. Please clarify what suspicious means. Keller didn't answer, his face flushed. He raised his voice. I said, get out of the car. Frederick nodded slightly. Yes, I will cooperate. But please tell me the specific reason. At that moment, everything spiraled out of control. Keller yanked the door handle sharply. Frederick hadn't unbuckled his seatbelt when Keller reached in, opened the door, and pulled him out. The book bag fell to the ground. The book slipped out, its first page fluttering open. Hands on your head, now. Frederick stammered, I'm not resisting. But his arm was twisted hard behind his back. A strong shove made him lean onto the hood. His head struck the edge of the car, the dull thud echoing in the empty space. Keller's knee pressed tightly into his back, making him gasp for air. You're under arrest for suspicious behavior and resisting. Frederick panted, his face pressed against the cold metal. I didn't do anything wrong. I'm a lawyer. I want to know my rights. Keller tightened his grip. Shut up. I know what kind of man you are. 3 minutes, from the green light turning on to the moment he was handcuffed. Everything happened in 3 minutes, but for Frederick, it felt like a lifetime. Later at the first press conference, the police spokesperson said Officer Keller stopped the vehicle due to observing suspicious driving behavior. No clear violations were recorded at the time. When reporters pressed for what suspicious behavior meant, no one could answer, because there was no suspicious behavior at all. One book, one old car, one retired man, one peaceful afternoon, in 3 minutes. Just 3 minutes to change his life forever. The pale yellow streetlight cast Frederick Jameson's shadow onto the ground. That shadow shrank, trembled, then was suddenly yanked backward. The cold clang of metal handcuffs hitting the pavement echoed sharply. No warning, no resistance from him, just a sharp tug, then a fierce shove that knocked him off balance. He tried to keep his posture straight, but Grant Keller's knee was already pressed into his spine. A rough hand grabbed his hair, yanking his head back as if forcing him to look up, not at the stars, but to take a punch. The first punch landed hard on his left cheekbone. No one, not even Frederick himself, could have imagined this could happen. Not to someone like him. A man who always kept calm in every situation. A man who believed all his life that reason and dialogue could solve any conflict. But there was no place for reason in the actions of a man carrying both a gun and unchecked power. Blood began to trickle from the corner of his mouth, running through his beard and soaking into his shirt collar. The stench of blood-crushed grass and metal cuffs mixed into a nauseating odor. But he did not scream, did not shout. He only whispered hoarsely, I'm not resisting. I cooperated. Keller did not listen. He did not want to hear. To him, Frederick's words were a provocation, a challenge. The second punch came seconds later, this time to the jaw. Frederick's head hit the pavement. His vision blurred. In a daze, he still heard Keller roar, Shut up, you don't give orders here. A man in the second-floor apartment across the street stepped out onto his balcony to smoke just then. He witnessed the entire event. He wasn't an activist, not a journalist, just an ordinary citizen. His hand trembled as he held his phone. Then he switched it to video mode. From above, his camera captured the full scene: Frederick lying face down, hands cuffed, legs too weak to resist. Officer Keller kept pressing down, barking orders and insults. You got more to say, huh? Want to teach me the law? This was no longer an administrative stop, no longer law enforcement. It was torture, a brutal display of power fueled by arrogance, protected by a system that habitually shields men like him. When Keller finally dragged Frederick to his feet, he was barely able to stand. His face was smeared with blood, his lip torn, his left eye swollen shut, his head tilted to one side, hopelessly struggling to keep balance. Go. Get in the car. Frederick staggered. He barely whispered, almost begging, "Can I call my lawyer?" The answer was a shove in the back. He fell into the back seat of the patrol car, legs still stiff and unable to bend. The door slammed shut. A woman walking her dog across the street also witnessed the incident. She stopped frozen, didn't dare intervene, didn't have time to film. She just hugged the small dog, barking incessantly as if it were reacting for her. Later, when asked why she did nothing, she said, "I was scared. I didn't know if I said anything. Would I be pulled to the ground? But I still can't forgive myself for staying silent." The scene lasted only 5 minutes, but the 30-second video that captured it sent chills through millions. Yet that night, no one knew anything. No statement was issued. No news report followed. Frederick was taken to jail, charged with resisting an officer and disturbing the peace. And the next morning, his name appeared in the records as a criminal. No one saw his bruised face. No one knew that beneath the cold gel photo was a man who once stood in court defending people just like himself today. Frederick lay on the iron bed, his hands still numb from the cuffs. He closed his eyes. His mind relentlessly replayed every moment: the gaze of Keller, the cracking of facial bones, the taste of blood flowing into his mouth. But what hurt him most was not the physical wounds. It was this truth: I once believed in the system. And then silence. A silence not of the night, but of complicity, of fear, of witnesses too afraid to speak until a video appeared and brought the story out of the shadows. The car door slammed shut. The echoes of that heavy metal thud still rang in Frederick Jameson's ears as the cruiser pulled away from the curb. His body ached in ways he hadn't known were possible. His wrists, red and raw, throbbed beneath the cold bite of the handcuffs. The inside of his mouth was bleeding. His left eye was swelling shut. But it wasn't the pain that settled deepest. It was the silence. The kind of silence that comes not from peace, but from erasure. From a system that doesn't just overlook the truth, it buries it. At 7:18 p.m., the official incident report was filed at Southside Precinct. The boxes were ticked, the language vague and sanitized. Suspect was uncooperative. Use of force justified due to perceived resistance. No further injuries reported. Not a single word about the punches, about the blood, about the trembling voice of a 66-year-old man pleading for clarity, for decency, for something resembling justice. Officer Grant Keller's report was reviewed, approved, and signed off within 12 minutes. No red flags, no investigation, no questions asked. In the official system, that night was just another traffic stop, another compliant officer doing his job. And Frederick, he was just another name in a file. His family wasn't notified, not when he was taken to the precinct, not when he was booked, not when he was placed in a holding cell without access to a phone until nearly midnight. It wasn't until Elaine Jameson, his wife of 40 years, realized he hadn't come home that the fear began to settle into her chest like a stone. She had called him earlier that evening. He had told her he had just checked out a book from the library and was heading home. That was at 5:57 p.m. By 8:30, she was pacing in the living room. By 9:15, she had called every hospital in the area. Nothing. At 10:22 p.m., she called the police, and they told her nothing.
Sure.
Inside the cell, Frederick sat on a cold metal bench, alone, dazed and covered in dried blood. No one had offered him medical attention. No one had asked if he needed water or pain relief or even a phone call until hours later. When they finally allowed him to speak to his wife, his voice cracked as he whispered her name. Elaine. Her response was breathless. "Frederick, where are you? Are you all right?" His silence said more than his words ever could. The next morning, Elaine arrived at the station just after 6 a.m., gripping a folder that contained Frederick's medical records and a worn leather-bound notebook that had once been his courtroom companion. She demanded answers. At the desk, the officer on duty barely looked up. "He's being processed. Sit tight." Elaine, sharp-eyed and sharper-tongued when she needed to be, didn't sit. She stood tall and said with quiet fury, "I want to see my husband. And I want to know why no one informed me that he was arrested or why no one offered him medical assistance." The officer gave her a look that women like Elaine had seen too many times in her life. That look that hovered between annoyance and dismissal. But he didn't argue. At 6:34 a.m., they brought Frederick out. Elaine gasped when she saw him. Her knees buckled slightly. She had never seen him like this. Not during the years of long trials, not when he'd lost his younger brother to cancer, not even during his own surgery the year before. His face was bruised and swollen, one eye nearly shut, lips split, jaw clenched in quiet endurance. Still, he stood, dignified, proud, even in shackles. Back at home after medical attention and hours of painful silence, Frederick finally spoke. It wasn't just the punches, he said, it was how fast it happened, how normal it seemed for him. Elaine nodded, holding his hand. "Did anyone say anything?" she asked softly. No, Frederick answered. No one said a word. No officer checked if I was all right. No one asked me anything. They just wrote it off. And that was it. No press release, no internal notice, no public record. The system once again tried to move on. In the following days, the world stayed quiet. Local media hadn't picked up the story. The Nashville Southside Police Department issued no comment, no press update, not even an acknowledgement of the incident. They didn't need to, there was no pressure. Frederick was released with charges still pending, resisting arrest. Obstruction. No one cared that there was no weapon, no aggression, no threat. No one cared. Yet. But across town, in a small apartment overlooking the intersection where it all happened, a 22-year-old college student named Marcus had just finished uploading a 47-second video clip to his private social media account. The caption was simple: "Is this what policing looks like now?" Within hours, everything would change. But before the storm, there was this silence. Heavy, cold, familiar. The silence that always follows violence, until someone dares to break it. Dear, the silence was deafening, but it didn't last long. Not in the Jameson household. Not under the roof of a woman like Elaine Jameson, a wife, a mother, a retired school teacher, with a voice like silk but a spine forged from years of standing up for what's right. She had spent the night pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor of their modest home, every creak of the boards under her feet echoing louder than the words Frederick had whispered when he finally returned from that cell. "He hit me, Elaine, like I wasn't human." His voice trembled, not from pain, but from something deeper. Betrayal, humiliation. She held his face in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks, and for the first time in their 4 decades together, she saw something in his eyes that had never lived there before. A fracture. A question that law books couldn't answer. Why me? And Elaine knew in that moment she wouldn't let the world stay quiet. Back to them. By 7:00 a.m. the next day, Elaine was already sitting at the kitchen table. The morning sun hadn't yet reached the windows. Frederick was still asleep, sedated with a painkiller, his body curled in the fetal position like a wounded child. She opened her old laptop, the one she used to grade essays and write letters to her students before she retired. Now it would serve a different purpose. She started typing. To the office of the mayor, the chief of police, and every citizen of this city. My name is Elaine Jameson. I have lived in this city for over 40 years. I raised my children here. I taught in its schools. I paid my taxes. I attended your council meetings. And today I write to you as a woman whose husband was brutalized by one of your officers. He is not a threat. He is not a criminal. He is a 66-year-old retired civil rights attorney who was dragged from his car, thrown to the ground, and punched in the face while handcuffed. He was treated like a suspect without cause. treated like an animal. And this city, our city, needs to answer for that. The letter was 3 pages long. It was firm, it was respectful, but it was unmistakably a declaration of war against the kind of silence that had allowed this to happen in the first place. She sent it to every local news outlet. She sent it to the mayor's office. She printed out 10 copies and hand-delivered them to City Hall. And then she walked back into her living room and told her son. David Jameson, 28, had grown up watching his father argue cases in court, hearing him speak at churches and town halls, always believing in the system. But now he felt that belief shatter. He sat down beside his father, still sleeping on the couch, bruised and bandaged. And then he picked up his phone. He opened the camera. He went live. The screen lit up and David stared into it, eyes dark with anger, voice low and steady. "I need y'all to hear me," he began. "This is my father, a man who gave his life to the city, who stood up for people no one else would defend, who believed in the courts and the law and justice." He turned the camera, slowly showing Frederick's face, swollen and discolored. This is what they did to him. Within minutes, the live stream had hundreds of viewers, then thousands. It was shared, clipped, tweeted. Instagram, TikTok, Reddit. People started asking questions. What happened to him? Who did this? Why was he arrested? By noon, #Justice for Frederick was trending in the state of Tennessee. By evening, it was trending nationally. All the calls began pouring in. Old students of Elaine, former clients of Frederick, civil rights activists, journalists, lawyers, even strangers. I am. By 8:00 p.m. and the first news segment aired on a local station. They didn't have much, just a live stream and a blurry clip from a witness's phone, but it was enough to stir something the department hadn't expected. Public outrage. The chief of police, who had remained silent until then, was now fielding calls from state officials. City Hall received over 10,000 emails in a single day. And Elaine? She didn't stop. She followed up her letter with a second statement, this time not to the officials, to the people. Interesting. My husband survived this, but how many others didn't? How many people were silenced because no one was watching? Well, we're watching now. Frederick, still recovering, watched his wife and son speak on local television. He tried to smile through the swelling. Remind me, he whispered, to never underestimate the two of you. Elaine took his hand, kissed his knuckles gently. Darling, she said, her voice soft but resolute, you taught us how to fight. And now they were fighting for him. The Jameson family refused to be quiet, and in doing so, they cracked open the first fault line in a system that had relied for too long on silence. It started like most things do these days, with a post. No fancy production, no press conference, just a clip, 37 seconds, long, blurry, and shaky, uploaded from a cracked phone in a second-floor apartment. The caption read, "He didn't resist, he didn't deserve this. Southside PD explained this." At first, the video trickled through timelines. A few shares, a few retweets, some comments with wide eyes and angry emojis. But then it began to move. Fast. A well-known local activist reposted it with the words, "This is Frederick Jameson, a civil rights attorney, beaten by police. Sound familiar?" Then came the tags. #Justice for Frederick, account the badge, #Southside PD, we're watching. By the end of day one, the video had 750,000 views. By the next morning, it had surpassed 2.4 million. And by the time the evening news ran its first full segment on the case, it had already been shared over 4 million times across platforms. Twitter turned it into a storm. TikTok turned it into a movement. Reddit turned it into a case study. People dissected every frame of the video. They zoomed in on the bruises. They time-stamped the audio. They identified the officer. They matched the squad car to a Southside patrol unit. They did what official channels had refused to do. They investigated. In one widely circulated TikTok, a young woman looked into the camera holding a copy of Tennessee's use of force policy. He was cuffed, she said, hands behind his back, not resisting, and he was punched in the face. That's not just misconduct, that's assault. Her video alone pulled in 1.1 million views in under 8 hours. People weren't just angry, they were activated. The comment sections overflowed. Some said he could be my dad. Others wrote, same thing happened to me, but no one filmed it. And others just said, I can't believe this keeps happening. Then came the art. Portraits of Frederick, bruised but unbowed, were shared by digital artists. Quotes from his wife Elaine's open letter were printed in bold letters across black backgrounds. We're watching now, that one became a t-shirt within 24 hours. Proceeds went to a legal defense fund for victims of police brutality. Even celebrities got involved. A Grammy-winning musician tweeted, I once heard Frederick Jameson speak when I was 19. Changed the way I saw justice. Now he's a victim of the very system he spent his life defending. This isn't just irony, it's a damn indictment. A senator reposted the video calling for an investigation, and a viral tweet summed up the moment perfectly. They messed with the wrong man, and the internet has receipts. Sure. Southside PD went into full lockdown mode. No new statements, no press contact. Their website was down for maintenance. But that didn't stop the digital detectives. People pulled public records. They discovered 6 prior complaints against Officer Keller, none of which had resulted in discipline. They posted side-by-side screenshots, one of Frederick in his hospital bed, the other of Keller receiving a community award 3 months earlier. The contrast was chilling. By day 3, the mayor's office could no longer ignore it. A press release was issued. We are aware of the incident involving Mr. Frederick Jameson. We take these allegations seriously and are conducting a thorough review. But the internet was unimpressed. People had already read the reports, watched the video, heard the silence. They weren't asking for review. They were demanding action. Frederick, still recovering, watched all of this unfold from his living room. His son David scrolled through posts, reading some aloud. They're saying you're a hero. Frederick shook his head slowly. No, he said. I'm just the one who got caught on camera. Elaine leaned forward, voice quiet. But now they know, and that was the difference. This wasn't just about justice for one man anymore. It was about recognition, about exposure, about refusing to let another story be buried beneath bureaucracy. Because the internet doesn't forget, and this time, it refused to stay quiet. The fire had been smoldering for days. Frederick's story was everywhere. The bruises, the video, the silence, the rage. The hashtags had spread far beyond Nashville. National outlets had picked up the story. Civil rights organizations were demanding answers. A petition calling for Officer Keller's suspension had gathered over 250,000 signatures in just 4 days. Still, the Southside Police Department had offered little more than carefully worded deflections, reviewing procedures, monitoring the situation, committed to transparency. And then everything changed. On the morning of the 6th day, just after sunrise, 4 unmarked black vehicles rolled up in front of the Southside precinct. It was quiet at first, no sirens, no announcements, just suits, badges, briefcases, and purpose. They didn't ask for permission. They walked past the front desk, presented their federal credentials, and requested access to all internal records. Every use of force report, every complaint filed in the last decade, every disciplinary action taken or not taken, the Department of Justice was here. Word spread like wildfire. Local officers whispered in hallways. Phones buzzed. Radios crackled. Did you hear it's real? They're inside. Yeah. For most officers in the building, it was a moment of confusion. For some, it was fear. But for others, it was long overdue. One young officer, barely out of academy training, leaned over to his partner and whispered, "Maybe someone will finally clean this place up." Back at the Jameson household, David got the news through a friend who worked in City Hall. He ran into the kitchen breathless. "They're here," he said. Elaine turned from the sink, eyes wide. "Who, the DOJ? They're investigating Southside." Frederick, seated at the kitchen table, blinked slowly. Then he closed his eyes. A long exhaled breath, and a single word. "Finally." Within 48 hours, federal investigators had issued official statements. Due to public concern and new evidence, the Department of Justice has launched a full-scale civil rights investigation into the operations, conduct, and oversight of the Southside Police Department. This will include a review of all patterns of behavior involving use of force, citizen complaints, and accountability systems in place. We are committed to restoring public trust. It was the first DOJ investigation into a Tennessee police department in over 10 years. And this time it wasn't just about one man. It was about a culture, a pattern, a system. The media exploded. Panel discussions on primetime news shows, special segments on national radio, opinion pieces in major newspapers. They all circled around the same question. How many more Fredericks are out there? The investigation uncovered what many had feared and what others already knew. Over the past decade, more than 85 formal complaints against Southside officers for excessive force, at least 22 allegations of racial profiling, fewer than 9 instances of internal disciplinary action. Most of the complaints closed within 72 hours, no body cam footage reviewed, no interviews with witnesses, no accountability. One internal memo leaked to the press read, "We prefer to keep these matters in-house to avoid media complications." That line became a rallying cry. People printed it on signs, chanted it in marches, spray painted it outside the station. No more in-house silence. Officer Keller's personnel file was subpoenaed. Inside were the 6 previous complaints that had gone nowhere. Testimonies from fellow officers who claimed he had a temper, that he used too much force, that he talked down to black drivers. None of them had ever reached IA Internal Affairs. The pressure was mounting. City officials scrambled to respond. The mayor, who had avoided direct comment for a week, was now forced to hold a press conference. "Let me be clear," she said, standing behind a podium flanked by American flags. "We support law enforcement, but we do not support abuse. We welcome the DOJ's investigation. We will cooperate fully." It wasn't just lip service anymore. Things were moving. The chief of police was placed on administrative leave. 3 command staff members were reassigned. Several officers were called in for questioning by federal attorneys. And the precinct, it was no longer business as usual. It was under a microscope. In the middle of all this, Frederick remained at home, still healing, still quiet, but watching. David came to him with news almost hourly, articles, headlines, live streams of rallies. At one point, he handed Frederick a printout in an article from the Washington Post. The title read, "How One Beating Opened a Federal Investigation, the Case of Frederick Jameson." Frederick read it slowly, then he folded the paper in half. And he said, "It's not about me anymore." Elaine, standing beside him, nodded. It never was. And that's when the realization hit. This wasn't the end of the story. It was only the turning point. Because now the entire country was watching. And the Department of Justice had finally stepped in to say what so many had screamed into the void for years: enough. What happened to Frederick Jameson wasn't new. Not to the Southside community. Not to the neighborhoods that had whispered warnings for years. Not to the mothers who told their sons to keep both hands visible when stopped. Not to the fathers who taught their daughters how to survive a traffic stop. No, it wasn't new. It was just the first time the world refused to look away. After the DOJ stepped in, the story didn't cool. It got hotter. Reporters from major outlets descended on Nashville. Local journalists, once hesitant, now dug deeper. And at the center of their investigation stood a single question. Was this violence an isolated act or part of a pattern? It didn't take long to find the answer. One reporter is Samantha Reyes, a soft-spoken investigative journalist with a reputation for turning whispers into headlines, was the first to break the wall. She filed a public records request for internal complaints filed against the Southside Police Department in the last 5 years. The initial response, "We are compiling the documents." The second response, silence. The third, a denial citing ongoing federal investigation. But Samantha was relentless. She connected with former officers, reached out to families, requested copies through alternate legal channels, and what she uncovered was staggering. 27 internal complaints involving excessive force. 18 of them involved suspects already handcuffed. 12 involved minors. 0 resulted in serious disciplinary action. Not one demotion, not one termination, not one officer charged. All closed with variations of the same phrase, action deemed within department guidelines. Her article went live on a Sunday morning. The headline, "A Pattern of Protection Inside Southside PD's Culture of Immunity." It was meticulous, documented, disturbing. She included interviews with victims who had never been believed. Black men who were thrown against squad cars. Teenagers who were detained for hours without explanation. A woman who lost her pregnancy after being pushed to the ground during a mistaken raid. Their stories had been buried. Now they were laid bare. News anchors called it a reckoning. Civil rights lawyers, they called it a civil failure. And the community, they called it what it always had been, truth. At a local coffee shop, 2 young organizers read the article aloud on live stream. One of them paused at the end, his voice shaking. "All these years," he said, "and nobody listened. But now it's in black and white." The other leaned forward. They knew. The people in charge. They knew about every complaint, every cover-up, and they let it keep happening. Back at the Southside precinct, the pressure was boiling. Officers avoided eye contact in the halls. Supervisors were summoned for interviews with federal investigators. Desks were cleared out. Files were copied. A climate of fear gripped the building, but not the kind that comes from danger. The kind that comes when lies start to rot in the light. In the middle of it all, one former sergeant retired just 6 months earlier came forward. His name was Dale Nichols. He wasn't looking for fame. He didn't want revenge. He just wanted peace. And silence, he said, wasn't bringing him any. In a taped interview, Dale spoke slowly. "I saw the way certain officers were protected, how complaints disappeared. We all saw it, but the culture, it rewards those who stay quiet." When asked if he regretted not speaking out sooner, his eyes filled with tears. "Every damn day," he whispered. The story grew. ProPublica launched a deep dive. A podcast series titled Beneath the Badge aired on NPR. It chronicled 5 years of unchecked power, one family at a time. Each episode ended the same way they filed a complaint. It was dismissed. No discipline issued. In classrooms across the city, teachers asked students what they knew about the case. Some drew posters. Some shared stories of their own encounters. One third-grade girl said her brother didn't want to walk home past the station anymore. "He says they don't like us," she explained softly. When the teacher asked who they were, the girl replied, "The ones with guns and names on their shirts." Frederick read the reports, listened to the podcasts, and each time the same thought burned behind his eyes. How many times did I sit in court, arguing for a system I thought was broken when it was never built right to begin with? Elaine, sitting beside him one evening, asked quietly, "Do you feel betrayed?" Frederick stared out the window. The sun was setting. "No," he said, "I feel responsible." And maybe that was the hardest part. Not just the pain, but the realization that even the good men, especially the good men, had too often assumed justice was already in the room. Now, the department's history was no longer locked in dusty drawers. It was out there on screens, in newspapers, in courtrooms, and the people they were done forgetting. Frederick Jameson was not alone. Not in what happened to him, not in how it happened, and certainly not in how the system reacted. Because the truth is, his story has been told before. Different names, different cities, but always the same silence, the same bruises, the same badge. As Frederick sat in his living room weeks after the attack, the bruises on his face fading, but the weight in his chest heavier than ever, he stared at the television. A documentary was playing. George Floyd. The scene burned into the collective memory of a nation was almost unbearable to watch. A knee on his neck, pleas for breath. The bystanders filming, the officers unmoved. Elaine walked in and froze in the doorway. She saw it in his face, the recognition. She didn't speak. She just walked over, sat beside him, and took his hand. Frederick whispered, "I used to think I was different." Elaine turned to him confused. "I thought because I wore a suit," he continued, "because I fought in courtrooms and not in streets, because I quoted the Constitution instead of chanting slogans that I'd earned some kind of shield." He shook his head slowly, but that officer didn't see the lawyer. He saw a target, just like they saw George. That night, Frederick pulled out a folder from his study. Inside were clippings he had saved over the years. Eric Garner, 2014. Sandra Bland, 2015. Philando Castile, 2016. Breonna Taylor, 2020. Tyre Nichols, 2023. Each one marked by tragedy. Each one marked by a system that didn't protect. Each one denied justice until the world demanded it. He laid them on the table side by side and realized something chilling. "These aren't exceptions," he said softly. "They're the pattern." He remembered being in a courtroom during the Sandra Bland case. He remembered defending a protester arrested for simply holding a sign outside the courthouse. The prosecutor had called it unlawful assembly. Frederick had called it a constitutional right. After the hearing, the judge had patted him on the back. "Well done, Jameson. You're one of the good ones." At the time, he had smiled. Now it made his skin crawl. Elaine placed a hand on the table beside the articles. "They always say that, don't they?" she said. "You're one of the good ones. Like that should be enough to save you." Frederick nodded, but it never is. His son David, meanwhile, had been researching too. He pulled up a timeline. 1965, Selma. Bloody Sunday. 1991, Rodney King. 1990, Amadou Diallo. 2014, Michael Brown. 2020, George Floyd. 2024, Frederick Jameson. "Dad," he said, voice tight, "you're a part of this history now." Frederick didn't respond at first. Then he said, "No, son. I was always part of it. I just hadn't paid the cost yet." In churches across Nashville, Frederick's story began to echo. Ministers invoked his name in sermons. Just like Daniel in the lion's den, one pastor said, "Brother Jameson stood for justice and the lions came wearing uniforms." At a community forum, a young woman took the mic. She was 19. Her name was Keisha, and her voice shook as she spoke. "I never met Mr. Jameson," she said, "but when I saw what happened to him, I cried. Because I thought, if it can happen to someone like him, what chance do the rest of us have?" That question hung in the air. It was asked in living rooms, in schools, on the street. If a respected, educated, accomplished man like Frederick Jameson wasn't safe, who was? One late night, Frederick sat in the quiet, pen in hand. He began writing a letter to the young people watching, to the students marching, to the children asking hard questions. He wrote, "I thought the war was over, that we had won enough ground, that my courtroom victories meant we could breathe easier. I was wrong. We are still fighting, still bleeding, still being silenced. And if you're reading this, then the fight has found you too." Frederick's war wasn't new. It was inherited, passed down, like stories, like scars, like survival. But maybe now, with his story laid bare, with the silence shattered with the world watching. Maybe this time the war wouldn't end in whispers. Maybe this time it would end in change. Wow. Long before the night Frederick Jameson was thrown to the pavement, long before fists replaced reason and silence replaced accountability, there were signs, there were warnings, but no one listened. Or worse, they listened and looked away. Officer Grant Keller joined the Southside Police Department 10 years ago, fresh out of the academy, top third of his class, strong physical fitness scores, disciplined, punctual, ambitious. But there was something else too, something not written on paper: rage. At first it showed in small ways: slammed lockers after roll call, an explosive outburst at a fellow recruit during driving drills, overheard profanity-laced tirades in locker rooms, the kind of anger that didn't need a reason, just a spark. In his first year on patrol, Keller was partnered with a senior officer, a man named Reggie Mills. Reggie had been on the force for 17 years. He'd seen it all. He knew what Keller was from day one. He was the kind of guy Reggie would later say in a private interview, who didn't look for trouble, but didn't walk away from it either. One night after a traffic stop ended with Keller screaming at a black teenager for allegedly reaching too fast for his license, Reggie pulled him aside. "You can't lead with your fear," he told him, "or your fists." Keller didn't say a word, just stared through him. By his third year, internal memos had begun to circulate. One obtained later by investigative journalists read concerns raised over Officer Keller's temperament in high-stress situations. Recommend further evaluation for rage control issues. A month later, he was moved to a desk for 2 weeks. The reason: routine rotation. But it wasn't routine. It was a pause, a desperate attempt to calm the storm without naming it. Instead of counseling, he was given paperwork. Instead of discipline, he was given silence. Then he was sent back on the street. Things escalated in his 5th year. Keller was assigned to patrol a neighborhood on the east side, a predominantly black community with strong ties and deep mistrust of police. Within 3 months, 7 complaints were filed by residents. 3 letters were written to the precinct captain. 1 petition circulated demanding his removal from the area. The complaints included aggressive stops, disrespectful language, intimidation tactics. In one case, a grandmother wrote, "He treats us like we're the enemy, like we're less than. I fear for my grandson when he walks home at night." The response: Keller was transferred to a different district, not suspended, not investigated, just moved. Later, it would come out that one of the captains had voiced concern to the chief directly. His exact words: "If he keeps patrolling like that, someone's going to get hurt." Or worse, the chief's response: "He gets the job done." And that's the core of it. Keller's file was full of contradictions: high arrest rates, high aggression, commendations for decisive action. But buried beneath it all, a growing trail of broken trust, a record of unchecked escalation. One therapist brought in to evaluate officers for fitness after incidents of force reviewed Keller's early file years later. Her verdict was clear. He exhibits signs of impulse control disorder, especially under perceived challenge or defiance. Left untreated, it can lead to violent outcomes. And it appears it was. So why was he still on the force? Why, after warnings and red flags and whispered concerns, did he still wear the badge? The answer: painfully simple. The system valued control more than conscience. Keller wrote strong reports. He made arrests. He didn't question orders. And when complaints came, they were handled. He wasn't a rogue actor. He was a symptom, a product of a culture that confused authority with aggression, that punished paperwork mistakes more than bruised bodies, that rewarded silence from superiors and submission from the street. In a closed-door deposition, one former lieutenant said, "We all knew, But to take his badge would have been to admit the system made a mistake. And the system doesn't like to admit mistakes. Frederick never met Keller before that night, never crossed paths, never exchanged words. But in that moment, those few brutal seconds, he saw everything that had been ignored for years. Not just one man with a temper, but a uniform that gave him permission, and a system that gave him cover. Now Keller's actions were under federal scrutiny, but for many it came too late. One community organizer put it simply, every report that got buried, every complaint that got dismissed, led us to this moment. They didn't just ignore a problem, they built it. And Frederick, he kept reading the reports, not to understand Keller, but to understand how many people had stayed silent to protect him, and that he knew was the real crime. Frederick Jameson spent his entire life believing in the law. He studied it, taught it, fought for it, trusted it. He believed the law was a shield, that it was sacred, that it meant something. But that night on the side of the road, with his face pressed into the pavement and blood running down his jaw, the law did nothing to protect him. Under the Constitution of the United States, every citizen is granted certain inalienable rights. They are not privileges, they are not conditional, they are not negotiable, they are guarantees. And Frederick knew each one by heart, because he had defended them dozens of times for clients who looked like him, who were poor like him, who were dismissed like him. The right to remain silent. He never spoke in anger. He answered politely. He exercised caution, not resistance. Yet he was shouted over, mocked, struck. The right to know the reason for an arrest. It was never given. There was no cause, no explanation. Only suspicion cloaked in vague words, acting suspicious. Uncooperative tone. The right to be free from unreasonable searches and seizures. His car was untouched, his body not so lucky. They searched his dignity, they seized his breath, and they left his rights bleeding beside him. The right to be protected from excessive force. Legally, force must be proportionate. It must be necessary. It must be the last resort. But there was no threat, no weapon, no sudden move, only a question. And for that, he was thrown, punched, shoved. At a press conference 1 week later, a civil rights attorney held up a copy of the Fourth Amendment. She pointed to the crowd and read aloud the right of the people to be secure in their persons, against unreasonable searches and seizures, shall not be violated. She let it hang in the air, then said, "Tell me what happened to Frederick Jameson wasn't a violation." The room was silent because everyone knew. Frederick had often said to his students, "The law is only as powerful as the people willing to enforce it fairly." Now he had to live the truth of that statement in a way he never imagined. His son David printed out sections of the Tennessee Code the night after Frederick returned home. He sat at the kitchen table highlighting lines. "Dad, this says they have to inform you of your rights immediately." Frederick stared at the paper. "They didn't," he said. David underlined another line. "They can't use force unless someone poses a threat. You weren't threatening." Frederick didn't look up. They didn't care. And that was it. It wasn't just a personal failure. It was a systemic decision. Because laws are not just ink on paper. They are actions or inactions taken every day in the field. They are upheld or they are ignored. And that night, Officer Keller chose to ignore every law meant to protect the man in front of him. Frederick had been on the other side of these conversations his whole life, sitting beside young men in orange jumpsuits, trying to explain the law to them, trying to convince judges that rights had been violated, trying to convince juries that race played a role, trying to fight uphill against a system designed to protect the enforcers, not the enforced. But now he didn't have to imagine it. He had felt the metal of the cuffs. He had tasted the blood in his mouth. He had heard the crack of his head hitting the car hood, and the law had stood by silent. Elaine sat with him later that week as they watched a legal panel on TV. One of the commentators, a former prosecutor, said, "Well, we don't know the full context. Perhaps the officer felt threatened." Frederick turned the TV off. He didn't speak for several minutes. Then calmly he said, "The context is that I was black alone and confident. That was the threat." Elaine gripped his hand. The hardest part, he later told a friend, wasn't the pain. It was the realization that everything he'd spent his life defending had abandoned him when he needed it most. But there was also something else, a shift, a quiet anger turning into something colder, sharper, more focused. Frederick wasn't done with the law, but he was done pretending it was infallible. And now he was ready to make sure it changed, not just for him, but for every name buried under silence. He picked up his old courtroom briefcase, dusty and worn, opened it, took out the Constitution, and began annotating it again. This time not for argument, but for rebuilding, because the law that was supposed to protect him failed, and someone had to fix it. The bruises faded faster than the fear. Within 3 weeks, Frederick Jameson's eye had returned to its natural color. The swelling in his jaw went down. The cuts along his cheekbone healed. His skin recovered. But the rest of him did not. On the outside, he looked like himself again. But something had changed. He no longer read at the kitchen table in the morning. He stopped going for walks after sunset. He flinched when the doorbell rang. And he hadn't driven his car since the night he was pulled from it. One night, Elaine found him sitting upright in bed at 3 a.m., eyes wide, breathing heavy. "Frederick," she whispered. "Are you all right?" He didn't answer at first, just stared at the window. "I heard the engine," he finally said. "Same sound, same pitch, like that night." Elaine reached for his hand gently. "No one's outside," she said. "It's just the wind." But Frederick's hand wouldn't stop shaking. "I thought I was back there," he murmured, "pinned to the ground. Couldn't move, couldn't breathe." She held him until the sun came up. Neither of them slept. In the weeks that followed, the panic attacks came without warning. A loud knock on the door, the sound of tires skidding, a police siren on TV. He'd freeze or tremble. Sometimes he'd cry. More often, he'd just go quiet, disappear into himself. At first, he tried to hide it. He smiled at neighbors. He took calls from reporters. He gave calm interviews offering articulate sound bites about justice, accountability, and reform. But the nights told the truth. So did the mirror. The man looking back was not okay. Elaine saw it too, and one day after watching him jump when the microwave beeped, she sat him down. "You need help," she said softly. He opened his mouth to argue, but no words came, only the welling in his eyes. 3 days later, they sat together in the office of Dr. Lena Crawford, a trauma psychologist specializing in survivors of police brutality. The room was warm, soft lighting, no clocks, no noise. Frederick sat across from her, his hands folded tightly. He didn't speak for the first 10 minutes, just listened. Dr. Crawford didn't rush him. When he finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. "I thought I was stronger than this." She nodded, calm and steady. "You are," she said, "but strength isn't the absence of pain. It's what you do with it." They met twice a week. In those sessions, Frederick unpacked things he hadn't admitted to anyone, not even himself. The recurring nightmares, the sudden rage, the feeling that his body didn't belong to him anymore. The guilt, the shame, the unbearable silence. Dr. Crawford helped him understand what he was experiencing. Post-traumatic stress disorder. Not from war, not from a car crash, but from violence at the hands of someone wearing a uniform. She explained how trauma works, how the brain stores pain in places reason can't reach, How the body remembers what the mind tries to forget. How healing isn't about forgetting, it's about reclaiming control. You didn't cause this, she told him. I know, he replied, but I carry it every second. And that's why we're here, she said, so you don't carry it alone. At home, the process wasn't easy. There were days he didn't speak at all, nights when Elaine had to coax him to eat, moments when he snapped at the boy at the TV at nothing at all. But slowly, something began to shift. The breathing techniques helped. So did writing in a journal. And being honest, really honest with Elaine and David. One evening after a therapy session, he stood in the driveway for the first time in weeks. His car was parked there, dusty, still. He ran a hand across the hood, took a deep breath, opened the driver's side door, sat down. His hands trembled as he reached for the keys. He didn't start the engine, not yet, but he sat there for 30 minutes, and that was enough for today. Dr. Crawford told him PTSD doesn't leave bruises, but it does leave damage. And recovery isn't about going back. It's about building forward. Frederick held onto that, like a lifeline. And when the anniversary of the attack came a month since that night, Frederick stood before a crowd in a downtown church at a community healing forum. He wasn't a lawyer that day, not a victim, not a name in the news, just a man, still healing, still hurting, still fighting. My scars don't show, he said, but they're real. He looked out at the faces watching him. Young, old, black, white, uniformed civilian. I thought justice would come from the courtroom, he continued. But right now I'm learning it starts in rooms like this. In truth, in honesty, in healing. The room was silent, then a soft wave of applause. No standing ovation, no chants, just acknowledgement. And for Frederick, that was everything. Okay, because the bruises were gone, but the work had just begun. Inside the Southside precinct, the air felt heavier than usual. Not from heat, not from smoke, from tension, from eyes that no longer trusted each other, from footsteps that echoed down hallways that used to buzz with false camaraderie, from the knowledge that someone was watching, and this time it wasn't just the public. It was the Department of Justice. The officers had seen it happen in other cities, Ferguson, Baltimore, Minneapolis, but never here, not in their house. In the base following the DOJ's arrival, the chief of police announced the formation of a new task force, a group of internal officers assigned to assist the investigation. They were branded the Integrity Unit, the goal to review body cam footage, to re-examine past complaints, to report patterns of abuse, a noble purpose. But inside the force, it stirred something else. Sean? Some called it betrayal, others called it too late, and many didn't call it anything at all. They just stopped talking. Officer Marla Jennings, 10 years on the force, quietly pulled her nameplate from her locker one afternoon, not because she was quitting, but because she didn't know what she was standing for anymore. I signed up to serve, she later told a journalist. But somewhere along the way, we forgot who we were supposed to protect. Oh, now we. Meanwhile, at roll call, silence reigned. No locker room banter, no jokes, no confidence. Officers were told to stick to their roots, keep their heads down, void unnecessary conversations with the media. The unspoken message, stay in line. But not everyone followed that cue. A younger officer, Luis Ramirez, requested to be part of the Integrity Unit. He submitted a handwritten note. It read, "We can't fix what we won't face." He was accepted into the task force, assigned to review use of force reports from the past 5 years. On his third day, he found something, a familiar name, Officer Grant Keller. The file showed 6 separate complaints, all closed, all dismissed, all marked inconclusive. One stood out, an incident from 2019 involving a black high school student tackled outside a bus stop. Ramirez read it 3 times. There had been a video, apparently, but it was marked lost in transfer. His stomach turned. That same night, Ramirez walked out of the station with a copy of the summary in his coat pocket. He didn't know what to do with it. Not yet, but he knew burying it again wasn't an option. Elsewhere in the building, dissent brewed. Whispers, grumbles. A few senior officers resented the scrutiny. "Media's got people thinking we're all monsters," one of them muttered near the coffee machine. Another replied, "Well, maybe if we hadn't protected one for so long, we wouldn't be here." That exchange ended in silence, in a broken coffee mug. Back at City Hall, the mayor's office issued a statement praising the internal review process. "Southside PD is working from within to hold itself accountable," it read. But in community forums, the public wasn't buying it. One speaker put it plainly: police investigating police has never worked. It's asking a broken system to heal itself. The crowd nodded, clapped. Meanwhile, Frederick watched all this unfold from a distance. He saw the news reports. He read the names on the task force. He recognized two of them from past cases officers who once testified to cover up questionable searches. And he said quietly to Elaine, "If this is what justice looks like, it's wearing a mirror, not a badge." He wasn't wrong. According to national data, over 96% of internal investigations into excessive force result in no formal punishment. The phrase "within policy" is often used. The question is, whose policy? Inside the precinct, Officer Ramirez continued his work. He wasn't sleeping much, not because of guilt, but because of pressure. He began to notice how other officers avoided him, how conversations stopped when he entered a room, how someone keyed his locker one morning, etched a word into the metal snitch. He didn't report it. He didn't need to. The message was clear, but he stayed on the unit because every day he found something else that didn't sit right, and every night he added it to a growing private file, one he intended to release if it came to that. By the third week, the DOJ sent a memo to the mayor. "While internal cooperation is ongoing, we have observed a concerning pattern of resistance and selective transparency." Translation: the system still thinks it can police itself. One evening, during a community roundtable aired live on local television, a retired judge named Henrietta Wilson took the mic. She had overseen dozens of cases involving Southside officers. Now he retired, she spoke with gravity. "I've read the reports. I've seen the files. I've watched as our justice system asked the fox to guard the henhouse." She looked straight into the camera. "And I say this with no bitterness, only clarity. Trusting the system to fix the system is how we got here in the first place." Back at home, Frederick watched her speak. He exhaled slowly. Turned to David. "She gets it." David nodded. "She's not the only one now." Still inside the precinct, the tension lingered, and a quiet question echoed from cubicle to hallway to street. What happens when the system investigates itself and finds exactly what it feared? But not every badge hides behind silence. Some still remember what they swore to uphold. Some still carry the weight of a promise to protect and to serve not a department, but the people. And some carry more than a badge. They carry the scars of being black, wearing blue. Lieutenant Reggie Howard had been with the Southside Police Department for 23 years. He'd patrolled the roughest neighborhoods, walked into homes broken by violence, talked more people off the ledge than he could count. And through it all, he tried to do it right. Fair, measured, human. But every time he spoke out, someone whispered behind his back. They called him the preacher in the early days, not because he was religious, but because he believed in something: accountability, justice, and dignity. When the DOJ investigation started, Reggie didn't flinch. He'd seen this coming for years. What happened to Frederick Jameson was horrific but not surprising. He'd seen other men dragged, cursed, disrespected. He just hadn't seen it caught on video. For Reggie, the hardest battles weren't on the street. They were in the locker room, in the captain's office, in conversations where the tone dropped when he walked in. He remembered one meeting clearly 5 years earlier. A young recruit had reported that his training officer had used a racial slur during a traffic stop. Reggie brought it up at the next supervisor debrief. There was a pause, then laughter, and someone muttered, "Kid needs thicker skin." Reggie didn't laugh, and they didn't forget it. In 2018, he tried to push for implicit bias training. He drafted a full proposal, presented data, even offered to teach the first sessions himself. The memo disappeared. No reply, no action, just silence. Now sitting across from a local journalist at a downtown cafe, Reggie was finally ready to speak on the record. His hands rested flat on the table. No uniform today, just a plain white shirt and tired eyes. "I love this job," he began, "but I've hated parts of this system for a long time." The reporter leaned in. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" Reggie gave a hollow smile. "I did. You just weren't listening." He paused, then added, "And neither were they." He talked about the internal culture, how officers who challenged bad behavior were called disloyal, how black officers were often expected to stay quiet or risk being labeled angry. He spoke of unwritten rules, how you didn't challenge senior officers, how you didn't file complaints unless you were ready to lose friends or worse, how there were files that never made it into the database, and how Keller had been shielded more than once. He had people looking out for him, Reggie said. People who saw what he did and made excuses, said he had a bad day, said the suspect looked aggressive. He looked out the window for a long second. "You know who never got that excuse? Me, or people who look like me." After the interview aired, it rippled through the department. Some praised him quietly. A nod in the hallway, a text message at midnight, a handshake with no words. But others, they stopped speaking to him altogether. One officer sent him an anonymous email. "You just put a target on all our backs." Reggie read it twice, then deleted it. Back at the precinct, he showed up to work the next morning like always. No special protection, no promotion, just a man doing his job. But now he wasn't invisible anymore. That same week, he was invited to speak at a town hall. He stood at a podium in front of 300 people, community members, off-duty officers, reporters, and teenagers, so many teenagers. He cleared his throat. "I've worn this badge for over 2 decades, he began, "and I'm telling you, good officers are out there, but they're outnumbered by a system that punishes the ones who speak up and protects the ones who shouldn't be wearing the uniform." He paused. There's no honor in silence. "Oh, so yeah." In the crowd, Frederick sat beside Elaine. He watched Reggie speak, nodding slowly. Afterward, they embraced. "I should have listened when you warned me," Frederick said. "And I should have shouted louder," Reggie replied. Their bond went deeper than the badge. Years ago, they had worked together on a youth justice initiative. Frederick had spoken to cadets about civil liberties. Reggie had talked about community trust. Back then, they had believed in bridges. Now they were fighting fires together. Reggie didn't stop after the speech. He sent a formal letter to the state's Police Standards Commission. He requested that Southside PD be mandated to undergo third-party audits every year for 5 years. He listed 30 past complaints he believed were mishandled. He attached his name. No aliases, no hiding. When asked by a colleague if he was afraid of retaliation, Reggie shrugged. "I'm afraid of waking up one day and realizing I didn't do everything I could." Inside the department, more whispers started to turn into words. A few more officers began speaking at community forums. A young black officer named Danielle Porter revealed how she'd been discouraged from writing up a fellow officer for using excessive force. "They told me it would ruin his future," she said. "What about the man whose ribs he cracked?" Something was shifting. Small cracks in the wall, light getting through, voices rising from the inside. And for the first time in years, Reggie felt like the silence wasn't winning. They gathered at dawn, not in anger, not with rage, but with resolve. By 6:15 a.m., the sidewalk outside Southside Police Headquarters was filled with people. Mothers with strollers, veterans with folded arms, teens with homemade signs, teachers, pastors, artists, workers, black, white, Latino, Asian, different voices, one demand: justice. The sign that started it all was simple, just 4 words painted in bold red: "We will not forget." A teenager named Tyra held it. She had never protested before, but she had watched the video of Frederick's beating 5 times, and each time it felt like watching her own father fall. She told her mother, "I'm tired of feeling scared. I want to feel heard." By midday, the crowd grew from dozens to hundreds. The chants were clear: not violent, not chaotic, just human. Protect, not punish. Justice for Frederick. Who polices the police? Inside the station, the blinds stayed closed. Officers watched from behind tinted windows. And though no orders were given, a quiet unease filled every hallway, because the city wasn't just watching anymore, it was moving. The protests didn't last one day, or even 2. They became a fixture. Every morning they returned, coffee in hand, chants in voice, purpose in step, and slowly, something extraordinary began to happen. Law students began holding pop-up Know Your Rights sessions on the courthouse steps. Pastors opened church doors for healing circles and story sharing. Local artists painted murals of Frederick and others like him on brick walls once covered in graffiti. And then came the policy teams. Inside the modest offices of the Nashville Community Legal Action Network, lawyers, professors, activists, and students crammed around whiteboards and laptops. They weren't just talking anymore. They were writing proposals, amendments, reform packages. They called it Project Rebuild. The goal: a comprehensive binding proposal for total reform of the Southside Police Department. And it wasn't just a wish list, it was a plan. Calling Item 1: mandatory body camera activation on all interactions. No exceptions, no power to disable. Item 2: civilian oversight board with investigative power and subpoena rights. Item 3: independent review of all prior excessive force complaints from the past 10 years. Item 4: de-escalation and anti-bias training, mandatory quarterly with third-party evaluation. Item 5: whistleblower protections for officers who report misconduct. Item 6: a community accountability fund, overseen by public trustees to support victims of state violence. Frederick, still recovering, that was invited to review the first draft. He sat at the head of the table, red pen in hand, reading every line. When he got to the section about officer immunity restrictions, he stopped. He looked around the table. This, he said, tapping the paragraph: "This could have changed everything for me and for a dozen men before me." He made one edit, replaced the phrase "when possible" with "without exception." They kept it. Outside, the protest grew, but not into chaos, into coalition. Teachers brought students to observe. Barbers gave free cuts while passing out voter registration cards. Musicians played gospel and soul and jazz songs of resistance and renewal. Yeah, Abraham. One morning, a group of nurses came in scrubs holding signs that read, "We treat trauma. They cause it." Media outlets called it the quiet revolution. What began with fists became an open hand, a demand not just for punishment, but for change. City Hall, they had no choice but to respond. A special council meeting was called. Over 400 people packed the chamber. Another 1,000 watched online. Elaine Jameson spoke first. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't cry. She read aloud from her husband's journal. "If we cannot trust the ones sworn to protect us, we must demand new guardians." A pastor stood and quoted Dr. King. A student spoke about fear. A teacher read names. And when they finished, they handed the reform packet 3 inches thick to the mayor. It had over 20,000 signatures backing it. The mayor nodded, hands trembling. "This is no longer a conversation," she said. "This is policy in motion." Frederick watched from home, tears in his eyes. He turned to his son. "This is bigger than me now," David smiled. "It always was, Dad. But now the city knows it too." By week 6, Project Rebuild was under formal review. By week 8, the first pilot program began, a civilian-led incident response team for nonviolent calls. By week 12, the chief of police had resigned. A new interim chief voted in with community approval took over. Her name, Latasha Brooks, a former officer, a reformist, and a mother of 2. Her first statement was clear: this department belongs to the people. Starting today, it will answer to them. Protest turned to policy. Pain turned to purpose. And Frederick, he still carried the scars. But he also carried something else now: hope. Because the city didn't just demand justice for one man, it began rewriting the rules so no one would ever have to beg for it again. The courtroom was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from emptiness, but the heavy, expectant hush of a room brimming with tension. Every seat was filled. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder, their pens poised. Activists, community leaders, and ordinary citizens crowded the benches, their eyes fixed on the front. At the defense table sat Officer Grant Keller. His face was impassive, his posture rigid. He stared straight ahead, avoiding the gaze of the man he had once brutalized. Frederick Jameson sat across the aisle, flanked by his wife Elaine and their son David. He looked tired, the lines on his face deeper than before, but his eyes were steady. "Isha." The judge entered and everyone rose. "Be seated," she said, her voice firm. The trial of the people versus Grant Keller had begun. The prosecution opened with a statement that pulled no punches. "This case is about abuse of power," the prosecutor declared. "It's about an officer who, under the guise of law enforcement, inflicted pain and humiliation on a man who posed no threat." She turned to the jury. "You will see video evidence, you will hear testimony, and you will understand that this was not policing, it was punishment." The defense countered with a narrative of a chaotic situation, a suspect resisting arrest, and an officer making split-second decisions. But the video told a different story. When the footage played, the room held its breath. There was Frederick handcuffed, being yanked by his hair, slammed to the ground and punched repeatedly. Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Elaine gripped her husband's hand tightly. David looked away, his jaw clenched. Witnesses took the stand. A bystander who had filmed the incident testified, her voice shaking. "I couldn't believe what I was seeing," she said. "He was already restrained. There was no reason for that level of force." A medical expert detailed Frederick's injuries: a fractured cheekbone, bruised ribs, and a concussion. Then came Frederick's turn. He walked to the stand, slowly, each step deliberate. Taking a deep breath, he began. "I stand here not out of vengeance, but out of a desire for justice," he said. "I want the law to do what it's supposed to do, to protect the innocent and hold the guilty accountable." He recounted the incident, his voice steady. "I remember the pain, yes, but more than that, I remember the fear. The fear that I might not make it home to my family." The defense tried to paint Frederick as combative, but their arguments fell flat. The video was clear. The evidence was overwhelming. In closing, the prosecutor addressed the jury. "You have seen the truth," she said. "Now it's up to you to deliver justice." The jury deliberated for hours. The city waited. Finally, the verdict was read: guilty. Showing a collective exhale swept through the courtroom. Elaine wept softly. David embraced his father. Frederick closed his eyes, a single tear rolling down his cheek. Outside, supporters cheered. Chants of justice for Frederick filled the air, but Frederick remained composed. "This is not just my victory," he said to the gathered crowd. "It's a step forward for all who have suffered in silence." The sentencing would come later, but for now a message had been sent. Abuse of power would not go unchecked. The system, though flawed, had spoken, and Frederick Jameson had been heard. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity. The air was thick with anticipation. Whispers of hope and dread mingled in every corner. Today was the day the system would either speak justice or fall silent once more. Frederick Jameson sat beside his family, the weight of months of waiting pressing heavily on his shoulders. Elaine held his hand tightly, her knuckles white, but her eyes steady. David paced quietly in the back, every inch the son ready to stand by his father. The judge entered with the solemnity the occasion demanded. Gavel in hand, she called the court to order. All eyes fixed on the defendant, Officer Grant Keller. His face was stoic, unreadable, but the tension was clear in his clenched fists. The prosecutor stood first. Her voice rang out clear and firm. "This case," she began, "has been about more than just one man. It's been about restoring faith in the law and holding accountable those who betray the public trust." Officer Keller's actions were not an aberration. They were a choice, a violent, cruel abuse of power. The evidence is undeniable. She detailed the medical reports, the video footage, the testimonies of bystanders and experts. Then came the moments that weighed heaviest, the emotional statements from Frederick himself, his quiet dignity cutting through the courtroom like a blade. When the divas took the floor, their arguments were weary attempts to downplay the violence. They called it a misunderstanding, split-second decision-making, and spoke of stress and pressure in law enforcement. But the jury saw what the video made impossible to deny: the deliberate and excessive force used against a man who was already restrained. "Chati." The judge called the jury to deliberate. Hours later, they returned with a verdict. "Guilty on all counts," the foreperson announced. A collective sigh filled the room. Frederick's lips trembled, but he kept his composure. Elaine wept quietly. David held his father's arm. Then came sentencing. The judge's voice carried the weight of history. "Officer Grant Keller is hereby sentenced to 9 years in state prison for assault and violation of civil rights." The sentence sent shockwaves. In addition to Keller's conviction, the court ordered the Southside Police Department to terminate 3 other officers found complicit through negligence and failure to report misconduct. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, cheers rising in the spring air. Signs waved. Voices lifted in unison. "Justice for Frederick." Frederick stepped to the microphone. His voice was calm, yet filled with conviction. "This verdict is not just for me. It is for every person who has suffered in silence, for every community that has lived in fear. This is a step forward, but the road to justice is long." City officials pledged to overhaul the police department. Plans for community oversight boards accelerated. Training programs on de-escalation and implicit bias were mandated. But the most profound impact was personal. For Frederick, this day marked a transformation from victim to advocate, from silence to voice. As the crowd dispersed, Frederick looked up at the sky. The sun broke through the clouds, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope. The gavel's final pound still echoed in Frederick Jameson's ears. The courtroom had emptied, but the weight of what had just transpired lingered in the air and within him. His body was slowly healing. The bruises faded, the scars began to soften, yet the wounds in his heart and mind were far deeper. In the weeks following the verdict, Frederick found himself caught between 2 worlds. On one side, the tangible reality of physical recovery, the daily care of his injuries, the cautious return to normal routines, slow walks around the neighborhood, tentative and measured, sleepless nights that turned to restless dawns. On the other, the intangible, the spiritual and emotional toll that no medicine could soothe. His trust in the system that was meant to protect him was broken, shattered, fragments scattered across decades of history, prejudice, and neglect. Basu. But Frederick was a man of resilience. His years as a lawyer had taught him the power of words, the strength in stories, and the hope that can rise from truth. So he began to speak, at first to small gatherings in community centers and local libraries, then at universities. He traveled to campuses across the state, standing before classrooms filled with eager faces, students studying law, social justice, public policy. He told his story not just of the night he was beaten, but of the system that allowed it, the culture of silence, the roadblocks to justice. I don't tell you this to break your spirit, he said in one lecture voice, calm but powerful. I tell you this so you understand the reality we live in and the work that still must be done. He challenged young minds to think critically, to question authority, to recognize injustice even when it wears a badge. Frederick's talks were raw, honest, and sometimes painful. He spoke of nights haunted by fear, of days when the weight of history pressed on his chest, but also of hope, of the power communities have when they come together, of the importance of accountability. At one university, a student approached him after the lecture. A young woman named Maya. She told him she felt inspired to join the movement for reform. Frederick smiled. Change starts with each of us, he said, with your voice, your actions, your courage. Outside of speaking engagements, Frederick began working with advocacy groups, helping draft policy recommendations, supporting victims of police violence, meeting with legislators, fighting to ensure that his story would not be an isolated incident. At home, Elaine stood by him. Their relationship deepened, forged through trials and triumphs. Their conversations grew to include dreams for a better future, not just for their family, but for the whole community. David, now a college student, joined his father on occasion. Together they participated in panel discussions, a family united in purpose. But healing was not linear. There were setbacks, moments when the pain surged, when nightmares returned, when anger threatened to consume. Frederick sought therapy regularly. He shared openly about his PTSD, encouraging others to do the same. He learned to accept help, to find strength in vulnerability. Through it all, Frederick never lost sight of the bigger picture. His journey was part of a greater movement, a tide rising for justice, equality, and dignity. The city of Nashville began to change too. Community policing initiatives expanded, transparency improved, programs for mental health and de-escalation were funded. But the fight was far from over. Frederick often said to audiences, "We can't heal a wound by pretending it never existed." He urged future generations to keep pushing, to hold leaders accountable, to never let silence be the answer. And so his story continued, not just as a tale of pain, but as a beacon, a call to action, a reminder that healing, justice, and change start with truth. Frederick Jameson stood tall, bruised but unbroken, determined to walk forward, because the healing was just beginning. Frederick Jameson's journey had taken him far beyond the courtroom, far beyond the pain he endured on that fateful night. His story became more than a personal testament. It evolved into a powerful lesson, a beacon for those willing to listen and learn. Universities began inviting him to speak not just as a survivor, but as a teacher who could bridge the gap between trauma and understanding. His first invitation was to the law school at a prestigious university. The lecture hall was packed with the students, future lawyers, judges, and policymakers. Frederick stood before them no longer just the man who had suffered, but the man determined to ensure that such suffering would no longer be invisible. He opened with a story not just about the attack, but about the deep wounds left behind, the fractures not visible to the naked eye, but as real as any scar. Trauma, he said, his voice calm but resonant, is not just about what happens in a moment. It's about what follows, the ripple effect on families, communities, and institutions. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. Law is supposed to protect us, but it often fails those who need it most. That failure is a responsibility, one we cannot ignore. In psychology and sociology classes, Frederick's story was used as a case study, an example of how systemic issues manifest in individual pain. Professors highlighted the intersections of race, power, and authority. Students discussed the long-term effects of trauma caused by institutional violence and the critical role of empathy and justice. But Frederick didn't want his story to be reduced to theory. He insisted on emphasizing two words: responsibility and accountability. Responsibility. He told a room of eager young minds, means owning what happens under our watch, whether we're lawmakers, law enforcers, or citizens. Accountability means acting when harm is done, not just reacting when it's too late. He urged them to consider, what does it mean to uphold justice truly? How can one balance power with compassion? And most importantly, how do you stand when the system itself is broken? Wow. His lectures were filled with questions, not easy answers. They challenged students to reflect on their future roles in society, to confront uncomfortable truths, to commit to change. Frederick's presence in these academic halls brought the realities of police violence out of abstract debates and into the realm of human experience. He spoke candidly about his PTSD, the sleepless nights, the panic attacks, the struggle to rebuild trust. When we speak of justice, he said in one session, we must speak also of healing. Healing is not passive. It requires action, compassion, and a willingness to change. His talks inspired student-led initiatives, from organizing community dialogues to advocating for policy reforms on campus. One group even started a mentorship program connecting law students with victims of police brutality, creating a space for voices that were often silenced. Outside the classroom, Frederick became a sought-after speaker at conferences on social justice, criminal law, and public health. He collaborated with psychologists to develop trauma-informed training for law enforcement agencies, a curriculum designed to teach officers empathy and restraint. His mission was clear: to transform pain into progress. To teach that trauma, while deeply personal, is also profoundly political. That the scars left by violence demand more than sympathy. They demand systemic change. During one particularly moving session, a young woman approached Frederick afterward. Her eyes glistened with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. "Your story gives me hope. I'm going into social work. I want to help people like you." Frederick smiled gently. "That's why we share," he said, "so hope can grow." Years passed, and Frederick's work expanded. He helped author academic papers on the psychological impacts of police violence. He advised policymakers on creating community oversight mechanisms. His voice was no longer just a story of survival. It was a call to arms for responsibility. Yet he never lost sight of the personal journey. Every lecture, every conference, every meeting was grounded in the lived reality of trauma and healing. Bond teaching through trauma. Frederick explained once, means embracing our vulnerabilities as sources of strength. It means recognizing that change begins when we listen, truly listen to those who have suffered. His story was no longer just his own. It belonged to the classrooms, the communities, and the generations ready to carry the torch of justice forward. And through it all, Frederick Jameson remained steadfast, a teacher whose lessons transcended the page and pierced the heart, reminding us all of our shared responsibility to ensure that no one's trauma is ignored and no one's voice goes unheard. The city of Nashville, once silent in the face of injustice, had transformed into a place of action and hope. The beating of Frederick Jameson had ignited something powerful, a movement that swept through the streets, echoed in the halls of City Hall, and found its way into the very fabric of local governance. Following months of relentless protests, community meetings, and legal battles, the City Council convened for a landmark session. It was a meeting that promised change, a moment the citizens had been waiting for with bated breath. Council chambers filled beyond capacity. Community leaders, activists, and ordinary residents packed the room, their faces a mixture of anticipation and determination. Frederick, Elaine, and David sat together in the front row, their presence a symbol of the journey from pain to progress.
Courtroom.
Mayor Latasha Brooks stood at the podium, her voice steady and resolute. Today, she declared, we take a historic step towards accountability, transparency, and justice. Our city has listened to its people, learned from its mistakes, and is ready to act. The council introduced 5 major reform measures designed to rebuild trust and protect the rights of all Nashville residents. First, mandatory activation of body cameras for every interaction between police officers and the public. No exceptions, no delays, no turning off the cameras to hide misconduct. This reform aimed to bring transparency to the most critical moments in law enforcement, the moments when power meets the people. Second, the establishment of an independent civilian oversight board. This board would have real power, subpoena authority, investigatory capacity, and the ability to recommend disciplinary action. For years, citizens had demanded a seat at the table, a voice in holding police accountable. Now that demand was finally being answered. Third, comprehensive review and public reporting of all use of force incidents from the past 10 years. This effort was about confronting the past, openly acknowledging systemic failures, and learning from them. No longer would these cases be buried or swept under the rug. Fourth, implementation of quarterly mandatory training for all officers focused on de-escalation, implicit bias, and mental health awareness. Training developed and evaluated by third-party experts to ensure unbiased and effective education. The goal was to shift culture, not just policy. The fifth, strong whistleblower protections for officers who report misconduct. No officer should fear retaliation for doing what is right. This was about breaking the code of silence that had allowed abuses to persist. Each reform sparked a wave of applause. Frederick rose to speak. His voice carried the weight of experience and hope. These reforms are more than policies, he said. They are a commitment to the people of Nashville, a promise that no one will suffer in silence again. But change is a journey, not a destination. Council members voted unanimously to pass the reforms. The vote was a victory not just for Frederick, but for every voice raised in the city demanding justice. The reforms took months to implement, but their effects were felt immediately.
Chapter.
Body cameras became standard equipment. Officers learned to navigate their duties under the watchful eyes of their devices. The Civilian Oversight Board held its first public hearings, bringing transparency to cases long kept in darkness. Community engagement increased. Workshops and forums created spaces for dialogue between police and residents. Trust, fragile but growing, began to mend. The police department saw changes in leadership and culture. New officers were recruited with a focus on community policing and respect for civil rights. Programs addressing officer mental health and stress were introduced, recognizing that healthier officers make better guardians. Frederick continued his advocacy, working closely with the board and city officials. He helped shape training programs, drawing from his own experiences to emphasize empathy and responsibility. One evening after a community forum, Frederick and Elaine stood outside the city hall steps. The night was cool, the stars bright. Elaine smiled softly. "Look how far we've come," she said. Frederick nodded, a quiet gratitude in his eyes. But he reminded her and himself that vigilance was essential. Reforms can be reversed, he said, but if the community stays engaged, if we keep speaking, change will last. Nashville's journey became a model. Other cities looked to its reforms as a blueprint for addressing systemic injustice. Frederick's story, once a symbol of pain, had become a catalyst for transformation. He knew the road ahead was long, but with each step forward, the promise of justice grew stronger. The reforms in Nashville had become a beacon of hope for many. They stood as proof that change, while hard-fought and slow, was possible. Yet beyond the city limits, beyond the headlines and celebrations, a sobering truth lingered. America's struggle with police violence and systemic injustice was far from over. In courtrooms across the country, other Frederick Jamesons waited. Other families prayed for justice that often seemed elusive. Other communities marched, their voices rising in anger and hope. Despite the progress in Nashville, there remained many officers like Grant Keller, guards of a broken system shielded by silence and complicity. The story of Frederick was extraordinary, but it was not unique. Decades of data revealed disturbing patterns. Police departments nationwide had struggled to reform. Complaints went uninvestigated. Officers with histories of misconduct continued to patrol neighborhoods. Accountability was uneven, inconsistent, and often absent. In cities large and small, tales of brutality and abuse emerged like specters haunting public trust. The question remained, how do you change a system that protects itself above all else? In conversations with activists and scholars, Frederick often reflected on this. The system, he said once during a panel discussion, is more than one man or one department. It's a network of policies, practices, and cultures that enable harm and resist change. He pointed out that while holding individuals accountable was necessary, it was not sufficient. Unless the system itself is on trial, we risk repeating the same mistakes, he warned. His words resonated with many. They echoed the calls of other advocates pushing for deeper reforms. These included transparent and independent investigations of police misconduct, demilitarization of police forces, reimagining public safety to include mental health professionals and social workers, overhauling recruitment training and promotion criteria, addressing the root causes of crime, poverty, education, and inequality. Frederick emphasized the importance of community involvement at every level. You can't fix a machine from the outside if the people inside don't want it fixed, he explained. He called for more civilian oversight, whistleblower protections, cultural shifts within law enforcement agencies, accountability not just in courtrooms, but in daily police culture. Across the country, activists were taking up this mantle. From Minneapolis to Louisville, Portland to Chicago, stories similar to Frederick's stirred public outrage and demand for justice. Fredericks traveled to speak at rallies and conferences, joining forces with those who shared his vision. In one such event, a young organizer approached him. Her eyes fierce with determination, she said, "We're not just fighting bad cops. We're fighting a system that allows them to exist." Frederick nodded a solemn agreement.
Awesome.
As he stood before crowds, he reminded them, justice isn't a moment, it's a movement. And this movement must hold not only individuals accountable, but the entire system. He urged policymakers, law enforcement, and citizens alike to understand that true justice requires transformation, systemic and sustained. The story of Grant Keller had ended in a courtroom, but the trial of the system was far from over. Frederick's voice carried this warning. The road to justice was long, winding, and fraught with obstacles. But with every voice raised, with every reform demanded, the light grew brighter. The system was still on trial,
Mutaj.
and the world was watching. Justice, it's a word that carries weight. It's a word that demands courage. From the painful journey of Frederick Jameson and the ripple effects that followed, we draw lessons that extend far beyond a single city or a single case. The first lesson is courage. The courage to speak when silence seems safer. The courage to stand when others turn away. Frederick showed us that bravery is not just about fighting in a courtroom. It's about confronting a system stacked against you. It's about telling your story, no matter how painful, to light a path for others. Courage also means persistence. Justice rarely comes quickly. It is a slow, grinding process, one that tests resolve and patience. The protests outside the Nashville police station didn't end after one day. They continued for weeks, months even, through rain, heat, and doubt, because true change demands persistence. It also means demanding accountability, not only of individuals, but of institutions. Frederick's story showed us that no one should be above the law, no matter their uniform. And yet, courage and persistence alone are not enough. Truth must be at the center. Truth, the clear, undeniable facts of what happened. The evidence that cannot be silenced. The voices of victims, witnesses, and communities. In a world where narratives can be twisted, truth is a radical act. Frederick's courage to share his story gave voice to that truth. His journey teaches us the importance of holding on to that truth even when it is uncomfortable or inconvenient. We learn that justice is not guaranteed. It is earned. It is fought for. And it comes to those who dare to demand it. His case also highlights the power of community. No single person can change a system alone. It takes collective action, a coalition of voices rising in unison, from students to clergy, from activists to ordinary citizens. The reforms passed in Nashville are proof that when a community unites, it can demand change. But those reforms are just the beginning. The real work lies in ensuring they are implemented and upheld. We also learn the importance of education. Frederick's talks at universities remind us that change must start with understanding. Educating future leaders, law enforcement, and the public is crucial. Only then can the cycle of violence and silence be broken. Finally, Frederick's story teaches us about healing. Healing is complex and ongoing. It's physical, emotional, and social. It requires support therapy and time. Healing does not mean forgetting or forgiving injustice. It means reclaiming power. It means using pain to fuel progress. As we reflect on Frederick Jameson's journey, we understand that justice is multifaceted. It is personal and systemic. It is immediate and long-term. His story calls us to act, to be courageous, to persist, to seek truth, to build community, and to heal. Because justice is not just a destination, it is a journey we must walk together. Even as the courtroom doors closed behind Frederick Jameson's trial, his journey was far from over. With Elaine by his side and their son David standing strong beside them, Frederick stepped into a new chapter. A chapter not just about survival, but about shaping the future. Together with community allies, activists, and advocates, they marched onward. Not to relive the pain of the past, but to forge a path toward justice that others could walk without fear. They spoke at rallies, community centers, and schools. Their voices carried the weight of experience and the fire of hope. Frederick often said, We're not just telling a story, we're writing the future. The future they envisioned was one where police violence was no longer a shadow hanging over neighborhoods, where accountability wasn't an exception, but a rule, where every person's dignity was respected regardless of race, age, or background. But change demands vigilance. The fight for justice is long and winding. New battles arise as old wounds slowly heal. Frederick and his family knew that every step forward came with resistance. There would be setbacks. There would be those who tried to silence the movement, but they were ready. Because this is not the end, it's a beginning. As you listen to this story, remember, justice is not handed down, it's demanded. It's forged in the courage of those who refuse to be silent. If Frederick's story moved you, if it sparked a fire in your heart, take action. Speak out, learn, support, and most importantly, never stop demanding justice. Before you go, please subscribe to this channel to hear more stories that matter. Together, we can keep these voices alive and keep the fight for justice burning bright. Remember, injustice anywhere threatens justice everywhere, but the power to change that starts with you. Thank you for listening.